Hi, I'm Ryan Kelly. I'm an editor, advisor, and interview coach for Passport Admissions. Welcome back to Admissions Mondays. What I want to talk to you about today is I want to convince you that the MMI interview is preferable to the traditional interview format. I know that that might sound crazy, but hear me out. Think about a blind date. Isn't a blind date kind of inefficient? You show up and maybe in the first couple minutes, you've already decided whether you like the person or not, and you just spend the entire rest of the date confirming that opinion. And that's kind of what a traditional interview is like. It's kind of really just about whether you get along and the interviewer likes you. That's really what a lot of the traditional interview is about. They meet you, they talk to you for a few minutes, they probably make up their minds about you, and then the rest of the interview, like a blind date, is essentially kind of a waste of time. Now, enter the MMI as the counterpart to that. The MMI is a little bit more like speed dating, where after several minutes go by, you move on to a new person and you're being interviewed by a new person, meeting a new person. And so you get a bunch of opinions from a lot of different people along the way. So it's a lot more objective and it has a little bit more of rigorous scientific analysis to it rather than just one session with one person. So I think like speed dating, the MMI is actually going to give people a better, more diverse perspective of you as opposed to a singular traditional interviewer with one interview session. So that's kind of how I think you should think about the difference between the two of them. And, you know, that's great if you hit it off with your interviewer at a traditional interview, that's wonderful. But you wouldn't believe how many times people come back and tell me that they just had a strange small foible, during the interview that kind of tainted it and gave it a weird social vibe. Or they just had kind of a curmudgeonly interviewer who just wasn't interested in getting to know them as a person at all and was interrogating them and just had a real clash in personalities between themselves and the interviewers. And they said that that kind of ruined the entire experience and process for them. So think of the MMI as being advantageous in that way. So first of all, if one session at the MMI goes poorly, it's just one out of maybe 10 stations that you're going to do throughout the entire experience. So those other 9 can outweigh the one. I've even heard of schools who drop the worst score out of all of your MMI evaluations. So you may not need to worry if one of them doesn't go very well. Whereas if one of the early questions at your traditional interview goes poorly, that could screw the entire thing. So think about that. Another thing is that a lot of students report back to me that the MMI is actually fun. I know that sounds crazy, but they'll tell me that it was really interesting. They got to talk about a lot of different ethical topics, act out a lot of interesting scenarios with the interviewers. And, the traditional interviews, sometimes people say they were fine or comfortable or not that bad, but rarely do they come back and say, oh, it was so much fun. The other thing is that the actors that you might role play with at the MMI, they're usually really experienced and talented. And so you really feel like you might be participating in a real scenario rather than just giving a lot of recited, regurgitated, memorized answers at the traditional interview. So I'd say that's a major factor too. And lastly, the MMI is just fair. It's at least more fair to students than the traditional interview. It's set up to try to eliminate a lot of the subjectivity and that kind of just personality clash problems that can happen during the traditional interview. There's rubrics, it's judging your decision making and your situational judgment and your behavior. It's not just a matter of happening to have the same hobbies or research interests as the person who's interviewing you. It's much more standardized. And even though it's a little harder to predict and maybe a little harder to prepare for, I think the way that you're evaluated and assessed is actually in your favor as the student. And you can really feel like you have the same fighting chance as anybody else at the interview. You're not going to come back and hear a story from your friend about like, oh yeah, I just hit it off with the interviewer. We talked about basketball or our trips to Yosemite or coming from the same small town. And then you're feeling like, wow, okay, I really missed something just because of my interviewer and who they were. At the MMI, and maybe people will come back and tell you that they got slightly easier stations than you or something like that. But for the most part, it'll really feel kind of like a standardized test where everybody had that same chance going in, and there weren't as many subjective factors getting in the way of the decision making. So you may not be convinced, but trust me, I think if you prepare for the MMI, you may actually end up liking it a lot more, having more fun, and feeling like you got a fair shake at the school. So if you're scared of the MMI, I hope this has made you a little less scared. Best of luck with your prep. I would definitely check out our other MMI videos we have on the YouTube channel. And I would also make sure that you read our Savvy Pre-Med blog to check out all the MMI articles on there. Best of luck during this interview season, and I'll see you at the next Admissions Mondays.